3 guests in the studio.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Bean Studios in Northfield, Vermont. I am live here with a very special group of gentlemen. Got to say, this is the first time I've had so many people in this very small room. However, I think we're making it work, guys. Thank you, Rob Williams, Ian Baldwin, and Guy Page for being here today. Thank you so much, guys.
Paul, before we do anything else,
Sure.
happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank
Happy
you very much.
birthday.
Happy
Paul.
birthday to you.
Much appreciated, guys.
Sing? No,
Yeah, maybe not.
No, let's not do that.
But he's 25. Can you believe it?
25 years
This mature
old.
young man is 25.
Guy, you got to use your mic.
Can you believe it? This mature young man is 25. And he actually understands, like, sound stuff. That's cool.
I wasn't picking on you. I just wanted to make sure you knew.
Yeah.
Well, I got to say, there's no group I'd rather be with today, guys. This is awesome. I really appreciate it. And thanks. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks
But I
for
know
having us,
we
Paul.
have some more important, interesting topics to talk about today. I know we are here to discuss the very important topic of weather modification, geoengineering, climate modification, which there is a bit of a difference there, and maybe you guys can explain that. However, I know we kind of know where we want to start with this. Following, of course, last week's floods, there's been a lot of questions in the Vermont Daily Chronicle readers about geoengineering and what exactly that is. Is this happening in Vermont? What's going on here? But I think there's a lot of confusion about what geoengineering is as a whole. So maybe, Rob, I don't know if you have the FAQs top of mind, but this is from our geoengineeringage.org, which is also someone that employs me, by the way, and two of the very gracious mentors and teachers of mine. They're here with me, so from OGA, that is. So, Rob, if you want to just let the folks know.
Sure. Before we begin, just a shout out to all of the folks around Vermont who are dealing with this flooding tragedy for the third time in, what's it been, a year?
Yeah.
It took me an extra 15 minutes to get here to Northfield because I was driving through a flood disaster relief zone over where I live in the town of Waitsfield and Mad River Valley. Two of our major thoroughfares north out of the valley, Route 100B and Route 100, are still closed. So I was taking a side route, Pony Farm Road, which everyone is driving in and out of to get in and out of Mad River Valley. And a special shout out, I think, to all of our friends and neighbors who are running those road crews.
That's right.
My basement pantry area is now dry. I'm working on replacing a culvert at the bottom of our small road with the help of those guys because the current culvert is no longer fit for the job. So we salute our fellow Vermonters who are really getting the work done right now. So thanks to all of them. And I don't know if Guy and Ian, if you have anything to add to that. Second thing, we're going to present an overview of weather and climate modification today. Paul, you graciously hosted Ian and I just over a month ago here on the podcast, and a number of folks said that was really interesting, but could you really break it down to kind of the basics? That would be helpful. So we've been researching geoengineering, weather and climate modification for many, many years. We spoke about that together on the last podcast. I imagine we'll link to that here. Before we get into frequently asked questions about geoengineering at our website, our geoengineeringage.org, just a couple of really wonderful resources. Vermont is blessed with the most robust public library system in the state. We're the most literate population in the country. Out of all 50 states, according to Vermont Public Radio, Vermont Public now, I guess. So these would be great books to ask your local Vermont Public Library to acquire. The first is a book by James Roger Fleming. He is Distinguished Professor of the History of Science and Technology at Colby College over in Maine. The book is called Fixing the Sky, The Checkered History of Weather and Climate Control. And one picture is worth 1,000 words. You see there, if I hold it up, a well-dressed white-collar technocrat, his hands on the levers of the weather.
1950s.
Yes, from the 1950s.
National Magazine.
National
Collier's,
Magazine.
I believe.
Colliers. Thank you, Ian.
That's
Yeah.
a pretty well-known photo in the geoengineering space,
Yes,
if I'm
it
not
is.
mistaken.
It is.
It is. Yeah. So this is probably the best peer-reviewed history of geoengineering written to date. And again, the subtitle says it all: The Checkered History of Weather and Climate Control. Second book is by Dr. Rosalie Bertell, recently reissued in what's called an enhanced edition. Dr. Bertell was incredibly decorated, had her doctorate in biometrics, a field I didn't even know existed until I read this book. The recipient of 9 honorary doctorates, as well as a number of other awards. And the book title is called Planet Earth, the Latest Weapon of War. And here you see, again, one picture says it all, a giant cannon barrel pointed at the Earth. And Dr. Bertell here really summarizes kind of the milestones, let's say, in the history of modern weather and climate manipulation. So the Planet Earth, the Latest Weapon of War. And then finally, and this is a nice resource because it's free, the entire PDF of this book is free online, and we'll link to it at ourgeoengineeringage.org yet again. This is by Professor Claudia von Werloff and 9 other powerful women PhD researchers around the world who've been researching geoengineering for a long time. It's called Global Warning. Geoengineering is wrecking our planet and humanity. And these are, again, 10 women, distinguished researchers from around the world. The play on words there, warning. And of course, women have always led the charge against war and towards peace. Can't recommend that book highly enough. So we're going to move to the frequently asked questions, and we thought maybe I would simply read the Q&A, and then Ian would perhaps embellish, and Guy would play the role of, all right, wait a minute. Let me make sure we understand this. So first question, what is geoengineering? What is geoengineering? The answer, geoengineering involves deliberate activities to change any of the Earth's biogeochemical systems. Preeminently the climate, we hear a lot about climate change, preeminently the climate either through manipulation of the atmosphere's chemical composition or through heating the upper atmosphere with electromagnetic technologies. The most famous of these electromagnetic technologies, it came up a number of questions on the Vermont Daily Chronicle page, is a technological system called HAARP, the High Altitude Active Auroral Research Project, HAARP, in the town of Gakona in Alaska. And this is a series of ionospheric heaters that have been in play for many, many decades. And I'll leave it there. That's the definition of geoengineering. We're strategically manipulating weather and climate for strategic purpose. I'll pass it to you, Ian.
Okay. Is that was the first FAQ?
Don't forget your
Yes.
mic, Ian.
Yeah. That's the first. Yeah.
What is geoengineering?
Okay.
Yes.
I think for people who are coming into this recently, and perhaps because of the unusual weather that has afflicted Vermont, people are wondering, are we being targeted? What's going on here? And here we are in 2024. But geoengineering got rolling, you could argue, during World War II. With anyone who has recently watched the movie Oppenheimer has some awareness of what it took to create the atomic bomb. And its explosion signaled not so much the potential start of geoengineering, but a complex, let's call it a Promethean complex. by God, we can do anything we want. This baby is in our fist. And shortly after the war, a huge thing happened during the war. The government, do we want that lighting?
Yeah, we do.
Oh,
There we
there it
go.
is.
Yeah, watch your
How
feet, Guy.
exciting.
Oh, hold on. Guy, watch your foot there.
Yeah, I think that's it.
It's-
Technical difficulties.
We're
good.
funky, man.
Yeah.
That's all I can say.
We're
We're
like you
funky.
There's wires
Touching
everywhere.
that wire. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, after the war, the military became the principal funder of all physical science. So that by the 1950s, science had become, outrageous as it sounds, a military project. The machine that you're running this show on is out of the military.
Yes, it is.
Okay. And I think people don't grasp what a long taproot geoengineering has. I'm gonna just read from an essay posted on our geoengineering age. A couple of things, and it involves a quote from one of the books that Rob showed everyone. It's called Project Argus, and it was run in the 1958, and it concluded in 1962. So, just by way of a preliminary, the troposphere is where the weather happens. It's where the air mixes, and it goes up about to maybe 30,000 feet. Earth being a globe, it's very different if you're on the Arctic or the Antarctic. From the equator, the thickness is very different, but about 30,000 feet is the troposphere. The next layer is totally different. It's stratified and relatively calm.
Mm-hmm.
It's the stratosphere. Onto the mesosphere and the thermosphere and the exosphere. All these spheres end up covering 100 and I've got my data wrong, I'm sure, but 130 miles at least.
Okay.
The ionosphere, which Rob mentioned, is like a blanket that wraps through some of those areas. And it protects us from cosmic radiation, which overall, by and large, is deadly to life on Earth. So mess with the ionosphere, and you're messing with, if you put it in war terms, with your shield.
Mm.
The spear's gonna reach you a lot easier without the ionosphere. Okay, so a sort of crazy guy named Nicholas Christopoulos was chosen to mastermind these tests, Project Argus, in which 2 hydrogen bombs 100 miles over the Pacific were exploded near Johnston Island, and another 3 bombs, nuclear bombs, actually atomic bombs, were exploded 100 to 120, 320 miles, 25 miles over a remote sector of the South Atlantic. Those explosions closed off radio communication for a few days. Okay. The bombs, the hydrogen bombs, exploded 100 miles over Johnston Island or near it in the Pacific, created flashes that could be seen thousands of kilometers away.
Wow.
The research explosions were kept classified for the next quarter century. So we're ignorant because since World War II in particular, everything is classified. And as we know from, for instance, the Kennedy assassination, those classifications should be declassified, but are not declassified because we're in a kind of almost psychosis in which we can't grapple with the past. I'm going to terminate this soon, but I just want you to know the military exploded a much larger bomb in July 1962. This is just before the nuclear test ban treaty was finally signed, which was a milestone. This was Project Starfish, so we jumped from Argus to Starfish, and it was a 1.4 megaton device. Big. That's 1,000 tons, 1,500. The largest ever detonated above Earth's atmosphere. Starfish, quote, disrupted the Van Allen belts and created an artificial magnetic belt and an aurora tropicalis visible as far away as New Zealand, Jamaica, and Brazil. Anyway, scientists studied the after effects and said it would take many hundreds of years for the Van Allen belts to return to stability. I don't know whether that's a scientific statement anymore, but it was made by scientists. Here's the final comment. In 1962, Edward Teller could boast at a party in Europe, and he's the father of the not the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb. And he's always was involved with all these kinds of exercises, including the atomic bomb. Quote, Teller, we know how we can modify the ionosphere. We've already done it. Okay? That's in 1962. Do the math. We didn't then, as a nation, say, well, let's sit on our hands for a few decades. So we're steeped in this. And I'll leave it there. It's an attitude.
And that's a beautiful segue, actually, to the next question and answer here at the website. 1962, that was 5 years before I was born. And the same year that Lyndon Johnson famously said, Paul,
he who controls the weather will control the world.
Yes.
He was vice president at the time, anyone who's wondering.
Yeah. So the first question, geoengineering is deliberate strategic weather and climate manipulation that goes back to the late 1940s and 50s. The second question, why is our research project entitled Our Geoengineering Age? Ian just gave you the answer, but here's the sum. Military and political elites have been engaged in weather and climate modification efforts since the 1940s. Yet, we have seen little public conversation about these climate-altering activities. The inhabitants of our planet Earth, and that's not just humans, by the way, that's every living and breathing creature, birds, bees, bats, whales.
Humans,
Homo sapiens. The inhabitants of the planet live in an era being shaped by geoengineering efforts. It is time to crack open the public conversation about these geoengineering activities, which we're grateful to Vermont Daily Chronicle for providing a news outlet for regular conversation.
Let me tell you how this all got started from my end. First of all, it goes back to the grade school reading our weekly reader, which is something we got every week, obviously. I love to read. I read every word of our weekly reader in 3rd and 4th grade. We're talking the mid-'60s. And I clearly remember an article about how we are now seeding the clouds to make rain. And I'm thinking, wow, they can like put seeds in the clouds and make rain? That's pretty amazing. So there was sort of, in my mind, an early example, I guess you might say, the only one I knew of. And then along came this not crazy young man, but rather opinionated young man, Paul Bean, who wrote some articles on geoengineering. And I published them for 2 reasons. One, because during his political campaign, my wife and I had him and a friend of his over for dinner, and I like Paul a lot. And also, the Chronicle exists for so-called crazy ideas, really unorthodox ideas, to be aired. And it doesn't matter what point of view they're coming from. If they're interesting, if they're current, and if they're unorthodox, we're all about it. So we were glad to do that. But I was, and to some degree still am, something of a skeptic about all of this. For example, one of the first stories we had on this, we had people talking, commenters talking forever and posting photos of contrails of jets. And I grew up in Mouts Bay, across the water from Plattsburgh Air Force Base. We had contrails all the time, jets flying over, B-52s flying over. And I'm thinking, contrails, big deal. They're supposed to, those just happen as a part of a jet engine. So I do ask myself, and I ask you all, what's the big deal about contrails?
Hey, Guy, would you say that when that idea was put into your mind back in 1966 or so, that it was maybe seeded into your mind? Sorry, I can't.
Yeah. See, the great headline writers love to tell puns. So you have a future in headline writing, Paul.
Good. I guess that's a good thing.
I loved reading Weekly Reader as a kid too.
Yeah.
Guy. But I don't recall. You're a little. I'm a little behind you in age, but anyway.
Back to the question.
Yeah. So the next question: of what value is geoengineering to human civilizations? The answer: geoengineering supporters will claim that geoengineering activity can, quote unquote, cool the planet. Bill McKibben made this argument as a climate activist in a feature article in the New Yorker magazine a year or so ago. Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb, made this argument in the Wall Street Journal in an op-ed in 1997. Let's use geoengineering to cool the planet and help solve the problem of global warming, quote unquote, as stated by the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which, for all intents and purposes, is funding and framing the official story about climate change, so-called. At our geoengineering age, we are actually arguing that the truth is more complex and that, in fact, it appears that geoengineering activity does the opposite of its stated purpose. Rather than cooling the planet by shielding the sun from the earth, as Edward Teller famously said, we'll give the sun an umbrella, or the earth an umbrella to protect it from the sun's rays. What could possibly go wrong? Instead of cooling the planet, geoengineering activities seem to actually be warming the planet. And we'll put that aside for now, and we can come back to it.
Greenhouse effect. Sort of like a greenhouse effect, really. Yeah.
Yes.
Trapping heat inside.
Correct.
Yeah.
And of course, carbon and methane and other so-called greenhouse gases are officially blamed for the greenhouse effect.
But you're saying it could be something else.
It could be something else.
I got you.
It could be particulate pollution, which that's what geoengineering generates.
Mm-hmm.
It generates particulates, chemicals, elements, very specific ones.
Yeah.
If you put them up where Pinatubo and other volcanoes of historical significance put them up, you're putting them up at around 70,000 feet, give or take. fairly well up in the stratosphere. Up there, they are well known to do exactly what Edward Teller said, 25 or plus years ago, namely, deflect the sun's rays. 1% will do it, and then it takes a full year, possibly 2, not much more than that, for them to finally filter down and enter the troposphere and eventually the planet's surface.
Okay.
So that is what I call blackboard engineering. It's academic engineers like David Keith at Harvard and many others who are proposing to help with the climate problem by creating a shield. Yeah. Never mind that the shield precipitates out in a year or so. Meaning, you want to do that? You're going to be putting it up there year after year after year with unparalleled pollution.
Now, I remember the 1800 and froze to death, the summer of no summer in Vermont, followed a volcano, the Krakatoa volcano, I believe. So that supposedly did make things colder and cooler.
Yes.
So does this stuff make it hotter, or does it make it colder, or what?
Hold on. So let's be clear, because you can't have a conversation about geoengineering if you don't at least understand that the atmosphere of the Earth has several layers.
Correct.
The most important to us is the troposphere. Just as the etymology says, it's where the air mixes. It's where we get rain and feel heat, etc., etc.
Yep.
The next one up is the stratosphere. It behaves differently.
Right.
But if you put even nanoparticulates, metal ones, up at 70,000 feet, they are not as light as, they have weight.
Mm-hmm.
They come down.
Yep.
As the song says, what goes up comes down. So it comes down. It just takes time. So one of the core problems of the blackboard engineers, funded by Bill Gates, the Rockefellers, and everyone else, the military included.
Sure.
Yes, we can cool the planet, but we have to keep doing it.
Okay.
So, and it only takes, I forget the number, but I think it's 20, I'm sure I'm going to be incorrect here. 20, it doesn't matter, 20,000 tons. Well, multiply that by 50 or 100 years.
And we have to keep doing it, they say, the blackboard engineers, up in the stratosphere.
High up.
And what we're seeing is this activity, this geoengineering activity, much lower.
They claim it's not even possible yet to do geoengineering in the stratosphere, if I'm not mistaken. They're saying that anyway. Like David Keith, for example, talks about it as if it's something that's not possible. We don't have the planes to go up there, essentially.
Well, that's not true.
I'm sure it's not true.
But
Of course
we have the planes to do the quantities David Keith and others are talking about in the upper or the middle stratosphere. We have that technology. The bummer for them is we got to keep doing it, and no one has studied, well, what are the health effects of that?
Yeah.
Okay. So
don't forget your mic guy.
That's blackboard. That's blackboard geoengineering. What the military has been doing for a very long time, but most of us agree it got ramped up at the end of the Cold War. Okay? So a huge event happened when the Soviet Union dissolved. And we have an entire economy built on war making. Okay, how do we do this? How do we do this peace thing? Because the American people are not getting a peace dividend. And it's a human tragedy. I'm not accusing someone of being evil. It's just that that's the system we built. It's a war-making economy.
Mm.
And so there are a number of us who believe that the new target, the new enemy that had to be struggled with was climate change. Maybe we didn't want to go here right now.
Yeah, maybe we want to stay. Well, we're staying on the FAQs, but I think the point that you make, we definitely should come back to
I
later.
don't feel like you have completely answered Guy on why, if you place these things at the level commercial airlines fly, 35,000 feet, give or take 1,000, and at the level military transport tends to fly, say a zone of 15,000 feet, between 20,000 and 15,000.
Okay.
If you put apart these nanoparticulates up there, they're much lower down, and they're closing off what's called Earth's cooling system.
I see.
Which is a convection
Yep.
cycle.
Makes sense.
Okay, and the blanket stops nighttime re-radiation.
Yeah. And
And it stops it because there's the temperature differential. I don't want to get too technical. It's all on the site.
okay.
And working Vermonters who are outside all day, every day, are not just observing this in the sky, but they're feeling
Yes.
the effects of this convection shutdown, both during the day and at night.
So this is the crux of this. Everyone else is saying, you're feeling hotter? That's because of carbon climate change.
Yeah.
You two are saying, oh, you're feeling hotter, all right, but it's because of...
The convection cycle has
Right.
been shut down.
Right,
Air
okay.
ain't moving.
I understand.
Okay,
Yeah.
because there's no differential between the heat on the ground and the heat on top.
It
Gotcha.
feels somewhat like being a chicken in a microwave. Truly.
I don't know what that feels like, but yes.
Truly.
Truly. And our audience members may know what I mean when
Yeah.
I use that analogy. You feel the air,
Right.
the sun, the heat feels unnatural.
Right, I got you.
It feels
Yes.
unnatural.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's often accompanied by, we'll get there.
So could one of you answer my question, though, about the contrails?
Yes, we're getting to that.
Oh, you
Let's
are?
get-
Okay,
Yeah, no,
good.
that's good.
Let's
Yeah,
get to that.
yeah. So next question. Geoengineering's supporters claim that geoengineering is not yet actually happening. And the most vociferous of those making that claim are the climate activists, like our dear friend and neighbor, Mr. McKibben. This geoengineering is simply an idea, a desperate idea that we might have to employ because of climate change. And once again, we have nearly 100-year history of weather and climate modification easily accessed to anybody who's awake and curious. So it would be helpful if environmentalists and climate activists took seriously the history of geoengineering, of weather and climate modification, and its consequences for all living things. That would be helpful.
Why don't they?
Let's table that for now. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but it's a really important question, Guy. So next question. So when you discuss geoengineering, you are talking about, quote unquote, wait for it, chemtrails, right? Our response. The phrase chemtrails, which first appeared in U.S. Air Force Academy chemistry textbooks, it seems, the phrase chemtrails has been weaponized in the popular mass media. This is a disinformation war as much as it is a weather and climate modification program. Chemtrails has been weaponized as a phrase to marginalize and discredit citizens interested in discussing geoengineering, derisively referring to these people askers of pesky questions, as so-called conspiracy theorists, etc. This is a disinformation conversation, a propaganda conversation, as much as it is about weather and climate modification. It's why we never use the phrase chemtrails in our work. We try not to.
I don't say that.
Yeah. And when people, and again, audiences listening or watching, when you use the phrase chemtrails, you are immediately dismissed as a kook.
Actually, probably us even saying this right now will earn us a nice little badge on YouTube and Facebook, and the fact checkers will say,
yes,
the UN says, and then whatever the
of
UN
course.
says. Yeah, so.
And once again, let me be clear. At our geoengineering age, we never use the term chemtrails, but it's important to point out how the word is used as a propagandistic, as a disinformation term. And the next question about conspiracy theory,
I was just going to say quickly, I think
relates
we should
to this as well.
Well, it really is important to note that chemtrail, the word itself, was coined by the United States Air Force. I mean,
we think.
It's at least.
Well, I don't think we think. There is.
We have documents.
We carried in one of our articles up on the website an image, a photograph. The book has an ISBN number.
That's right.
Okay, and it has a cover, and we photographed it and used it. It says chemtrails. That happened exactly at the end of the Cold War.
1992, right?
90.
Okay.
And 91, freshman year 90 of the academy, and spring semester 91. So we have a publisher, and we have an ISBN number, and we have an image. Such is the nature of our world that 10 years later, it was the U.S. Air Force that denounced the use of the term they originated.
Anyhow, I just thought that was important.
It's really important.
I think it's really important
Yeah,
because we get blackballed for using that word, but it's like, why? I didn't come up with it.
Yeah, and that was a really good explanation. Thank you.
A lot of words in our culture war that fit that category. Originally perfectly appropriate words that, because of the culture change or whatever, are now shibboleths. Do not say that word.
Yeah, and the word geoengineering is a scientific and policy word that the government, corporations, the military are all using now to describe this phenomena of weather and climate modification. It goes by many names: solar radiation management, cloud whitening, cloud brightening.
Yeah.
People still use the term chemtrails, etc. Right?
So
but we prefer the term geoengineering.
The National Academy of Sciences, which is as prestigious as you get in our country, published a massive book on the policy implications of climate change and what to do about it. This was in 1992. In that book are 65 printed pages on geoengineering, what we can do about it. There's nothing new.
Yeah.
Under the sun.
This work goes back close to 100 years. Yeah, that's right. So last question on the FAQs, and then we can crack it open. Assuming you are correct in stating that geoengineering is already occurring, and Guy, this goes to your question earlier, why don't we see more public conversation about it? The answer, and we'll piggyback a little bit. In 1978, signatory nations signed a United Nations treaty called the Environmental Modification Treaty, in which nations who signed on to ENMOD, the Environmental Modification Treaty, were agreeing on paper not to use weather and climate modification for military purposes. For military purposes.
Because this is the just to interpolate
Please.
here, Rob. Nations, when they found out, the international community, that we had been using geoengineering as a warfare tactic in Vietnam, they were so outraged that at the end of the war, they wanted a treaty to prevent it. This was the negotiations Rob's talking about.
Yeah, the Environmental Modification Treaty, which drove public conversation about weather and climate modification, which was very much in view for the first several decades of these activities, drove that public conversation underground. And of course, right around that time, shortly thereafter, we witnessed the birth of a new narrative about weather and climate, which was the greenhouse gases are human anthropocentric activity. Greenhouse gases are causing so-called climate change, and we must sound the alarm. And this, of course, was funded also by the United Nations and the Rockefellers through the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Earth Day in 1992, the writing of Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, shortly thereafter, the creation of An Inconvenient Truth in 2005 with former Vice President Al Gore. So just to name a few of the bazillions of dollars spent on bringing this new story about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions into the global public view. So conversations about weather and climate modification went underground in the late 70s, and we saw the emergence in the 80s and 90s of a new narrative. Apocalyptic climate change caused by you and by me, the human species. And just to address a question that came up on the Vermont Daily Chronicle, it was the very last question posed under the story that you published last week. And I can't remember I think his name might have been Tim. He said, so what you're saying is that humans are causing climate change and we should be concerned. That seems like an old story. No. What we're saying is the story we're being told about climate change is incorrect and, in fact, quite dangerous if accepted at face value. Humans are causing climate change, but to quote the great folk singer Utah Phillips, the humans causing climate change have names and addresses, mostly in Washington, D.C. and beyond.
Yeah.
It's not everybody that's doing this, right? It's a core group of military planners, corporations, government officials.
It's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people, but it's not, listener and viewer, it's probably not you.
Yeah.
Well, and just quickly, before anyone out there who says, how could there be so many people involved in this, like you guys are saying, and nobody knows anything about it? How could that be the thing? Well, I'll remind you, I believe it was about 300,000 people that worked on the Manhattan Project, and a large majority of them had no idea what they were working on until the bomb was blown up. So that's something we should be very, when we go back to what we were talking about with the movie Oppenheimer and really the foundation of geoengineering as a whole, that's a really important point to make. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Compartmentalization.
Exactly.
Yes. Compartmentalization. Good, Paul.
So is that all the FAQs?
Yes.
Okay. So I know we have some questions to answer from the Chronicle.
Mm-hmm.
Some of our viewers, do you have them screenshotted?
I do.
I can pull them up and ask if you want.
I do them right here. Why don't you pull up, under
Sure.
Sword of Truth had a really phenomenal list. And I think we've touched on a number of them. And if there are any questions coming in, too, of course, however you think we should play it. And
I do want to touch on there are comments that we have some people. Some people are saying, EJ writes, agree, much hotter. N-Bar writes, agree, chemtrail topic turns people off. And Mr. James 802 writes, everything man knows about climate change comes from government sources. And Kate Bowen writes, maybe former Representative David Dean could weigh in on how he's lobbied to dismantle Vermont dams for the past 2 decades. VNRC, Free VT Rivers, and other environmental extremist organizations have been using our tax dollars to take out dams historically built after freshet floods damaged areas in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That's a very important point to make.
It is. And I think we want to, whenever we decide to button this up, let's allot the last 10 minutes or so to talk about what Governor Scott said a few days ago in his press conference about the flooding and climate change.
Definitely.
So I think that'd be a nice way to wrap up. But we do have a bunch of questions. Do you want me to mention them here? Or
I can read them to you if you want, and then we could...
Yeah.
Okay. So... what do controlled weather forecasts from the Fairbanks Museum of Science refer to? Maybe you guys don't know the answer to that question. I don't. Either of you? No.
Quote unquote controlled weather.
Controlled weather, yeah.
So let me speculate. Those of us watching the weather apps on our mobile phones are noticing pretty quickly that they're never accurate.
No.
Have you noticed that?
I have noticed this.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing, too, is we now have icons on the mobile phone weather apps to indicate particulate pollution days. which I find fascinating. We now actually, like, we have the sun icon, we have the cloud icon, we have the rain icon, and we have a sun with particulate icon. That
Really?
Yes, that indicates that it's going to be particularly hazy in perhaps sort of an unnatural, maybe man-made way. Now, some speculate that the weather apps are owned by the military. Do the research. I'm not going to say one way or another. However, I think the answer to this question about controlled weather seems to indicate that the meteorologists are, for whatever reasons, getting on board with this notion of artificial weather. Right. There's a brilliant activist in California, Rosalind Peterson, another one of these powerful women. I consider her the Rachel Carson of the geoengineering free movement. And she used to ask a question every time she gave a public presentation, including in front of the United Nations, by the way. She was an amazing activist. Brilliant woman, biologist, crop loss adjuster for the state of California, spent her career roaming the state of California, watching the skies, measuring soil samples, water samples, forests, etc., and being like, something's going on here. Let me tell you about it. But she used to ask the question, how do you like your weather? Natural or man-made? And she was asking that question in the 90s because she had figured out what was going on. So I think this idea of controlled weather is something that all citizens who care about this living, breathing planet and our place on it should be more attentive to.
Okay, I was a little confused by the question, but I'm glad you knew what they meant, and
I think that's
what they meant too. Okay, here's another question. What is the chemical makeup of these aerosols? Do different applications use different chemical makeups? That might be
so that anyone curious enough can go and hit on our geoengineeringage.org the science button, and they will see something on the order of 50 papers, the great bulk of which demonstrate, I shouldn't use that word, indicate, and I think demonstrate is a fair word, that coal fly ash is the likely additive in jet fuel that gives all of the trace minerals found planet-wide in post-spring samples of rain, snowmelt, and the like.
Okay. I think that's a good answer. Okay. How do these chemicals interact and affect with that which is living? How do these chemicals affect living beings, animals?
Same answer. Go to those papers, perhaps fewer than 30, but over 20 are co-authored or are co-authored by Mark Whiteside, an MD who is a research biologist in Florida, and with Marvin Herndon, our chief scientist. He has documented in incredible detail how the precipitation of these chemicals from coal fly ash affects all forms of life.
Okay. So anyone can just want to let them know again where can they go to see that?
Our geoengineeringage.org, and up there you'll see a panel, one of which is science, another of which is essays. There are other panels, including FAQ. Hit the science panel and browse through it. Browse through the literature. If you want an answer like the one you just asked, there's a great deal of material.
So, Ian, I have a skeptical pushback question on fly ash. I've been told that coal plants inject ash way up in the atmosphere, and it can come down thousands of miles away. So coal ash is ubiquitous. No surprise that it would be found in Alaska or somewhere like that. So is it possible that the coal ash we're finding is simply residue from 2 centuries of coal production?
Not 2 centuries. That's a good question, Guy. The best I can do, the Chinese are building a coal fly ash plant every week.
Okay.
Okay. So they are being built. I don't know their technology. Perhaps I should. It's certainly in the Western countries, we're not shooting it up any longer.
Okay.
There are precipitators, and that's why it's a huge industrial waste stream.
Yeah.
Maybe the biggest on the planet, but one of them. And it's dirt cheap in case someone wants to use it as an additive.
Oh, yeah, the perfect additive. Yes.
Dirt cheap.
Yes.
Are there more than one sources of it? Undoubtedly.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So moving on to the next question. Guy, if you want to take that microphone off, it just picks up the vibration from the fan. I know. It's very, everything's very sensitive. And there's a IE to the question. Why are trees wilting? And where there's a lot of aluminum and sulfate use, fires? ? How do these chemicals affect insects, birds, food chain? How does it affect the water? Everything depends on a carbon-based life for it to live on.
Let me take a whack. So imagine now that nanoparticulate metals have been deployed and placed in the atmosphere for closing in on 3 decades now, 30 years almost. And as Ian pointed out, ultimately those nanoparticulate metals will fall to the earth, and they will coat our trees, and they will inhabit our streams and rivers and our fields and forests. We know from talking and listening to so-called wildfire fighters all over the country, they routinely say something like this: these fires we are fighting, we have never seen anything like this before in the history of firefighting, wildfire so-called fighting. One example, trees. When you coat trees with nanoparticulate metals, aluminum in particular, aluminum is, number one, a desiccant. It dries up the trees and literally kills them from the outside in. Number two, aluminum is an accelerant when it comes to fires.
What could go wrong?
Yes. So the reason we're seeing these one of the reasons, not the only, but one of the reasons we're seeing these huge conflagrations in places like California, which is ground zero, given the way weather travels across the North American continent, west to east predominantly. The reason why we're seeing these huge so-called wildfires in California seems to have a lot to do with this weather and climate modification activity that goes back to the early 90s in earnest.
Now they would say it's drought. We've got all this drought.
Desiccant.
Yeah, it's not that drought
out.
doesn't contribute.
Of course.
And of course, what's causing the drought? One doesn't know at this point. But these are not little black and white boxes that we fill out. It's a complex thing because you're dealing with a system so complex that only the most arrogant people could imagine they can model it.
So, or only the most arrogant people could claim that a single so-called greenhouse gas or two is the chief culprit.
Sure. Yeah. And we don't want to hear about anything else.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Now, what even Paul doesn't know about me is that in between my career as a journalist and as a lobbyist for 2 or 3 years, I was a roofer. I was a contract roofer.
I knew that guy.
You did know?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
I knew that.
Yes. And one of the things that I learned and often did was when you have moss on a roof, and you can't get that moss, you have to pry it off with a spatula if you're lucky, or you can put copper or aluminum sulfate on it, and it dries right up and goes right away.
Good.
It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And so, so imagine doing that to
that's a helpful thing to know. Yeah.
And just on this, one more thing. A lot of folks will say, rightly, what about La Nina, El Nino?
Oh, right.
La Nina. What about these larger kind of weather patterns of moisture and dryness? And remember, weather and climate modification efforts have been underway for close to 100 years. Storms have been steered since the 1950s. Look at Project Storm Fury, for example. There's dozens and dozens
or
of military
Cirrus.
projects.
Yeah.
The list goes on. So when we look at weather patterns that impact climate regionally, nationally, globally, let's remember that these weather and climate modification projects have been underway for a long time and no doubt contribute.
Right. Do any of you know Roger Hill, the meteorologist for WDEV?
Yes, I do.
Because he was trained in the Army to do this. And I wonder if he has a perspective on all of this, both from his extensive meteorological experience and also his Army background.
I love that question. Let's ask him.
Yeah, we should.
I am inclined to believe that he might be willing to have the conversation. And I can't say anything more, but that's what I'll say.
It would be good.
Yeah, it would be. I think he would have I think he might do that.
Yeah.
Like the climate activists, it would be nice if the meteorologists and the meteorological community took more seriously weather and climate modification efforts and the history of this.
Well, before I move on to the next question, why do you think it is that so many don't? Why do you think it is so many of these climate activists, environmentalists, weather and modification, or excuse me, meteorological people? Why don't they ask these questions?
For the environmentalists, I'm sure there are many reasons. I worked in the environmental movement in the 70s, specifically the Environmental Defense Fund and others, National Audubon, National Resources Council. And something happened. It was a wonderful decade of activism. We sued the bastards and won a lot of court cases. I mean, a huge documentary could be done on that whole period. Something changed after the passage of NMOD. As Rob pointed out, there was a sea change that took place, I guess with the roughly coincident with the end of the Carter administration, the beginning of the Reagan administration. And corporate funding became enormous. So Environmental Defense Fund, which had a budget of, I don't know, $1 million or $2 million, suddenly was 10, 12, 13, 14, 15,000 million. Paid for by whom?
I see.
And I think it's not in their interest to go into such a difficult subject.
No. Financially, you mean?
They have to calculate. They have to calculate.
And the other, of course, another reason, there are many, is the imposing presence of the U.S. military and intelligence communities. It cannot be underestimated.
Right? No, not at all.
Right. The info, the amount of money, we're talking about literally tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars tied up in advancing the official story of climate change, which is the greenhouse gases caused by humans, rather than looking at the single biggest polluter, particulate pollution, on the planet, which of course is the U.S. military. I've never heard Greta Thunberg, or Bill McKibben for that matter, in a public speech, point this out.
How dare you!
Thank you, Paul. The single biggest particulate pollution purveyor in the world is the U.S. military, collectively.
That's a very good point.
Collectively.
How is that so?
The U.S. military burns 1 million barrels of oil per day to maintain its network of somewhere between 750 and 1,000 military bases in 150 plus countries around the world.
Okay.
And that's foreign bases. That doesn't include right here in the USA.
Nor does it include these projects we're talking about, weather and climate.
And it doesn't include dark operations.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so moving on to the next question.
Actually,
Sure, guy.
When you said Environmental Defense Fund, I'm thinking, the operative word, as you both then pointed out, is funding. Always, when you have any activist organization with an agenda, always look at who is funding them, because that will tell you almost always what it is they're going to say and what they won't say.
I love this point, and I will often see my friends in the environmentalist or environmental community identify themselves as an environmentalist and a climate activist. And what's curious to me about those two monikers is this. If you claim to be an environmentalist, but as a climate activist, you're not looking at geoengineering, weather and climate modification,
Cognitive dissonance.
you have no business calling yourself an environmentalist.
Attaboy. I agree.
Yeah.
That nails it.
And let me be clear, too. I say this as someone trained in environmental history, teaching environmental history for 30 years. I've been an environmental journalist for a long, long time, and it makes me sad to watch the abandonment of environmental or environmentalist principles on behalf of advancing this apocalyptic climate activist or climate change, officially stated, narrative.
But it's also follow the money.
And
as Guy pointed
follow the
out.
money.
Well, that's a great explanation, guys. Okay, so we have another question. What are companies / pilots being paid to disperse these carcinogenic pollutants on all of us? Quid bono? Sorry,
Cui bono.
Cui bono, yeah. What is the agenda?
So that's a good question. And earlier we had a talk, we discussed how many people were involved. And the number is huge. And your analogy to the Manhattan Project was also apropos, but today it's on a scale that's incredible. In the last year, pilots, it seems to me we have a video out there in the last 2 weeks of pilots speaking up, or at least one of them.
There's been a handful.
And then we just put up on the site,
Our geoengineering.org.
our geoengineeringage.org, that's the wrong one.
This is retired commercial airline pilot Mark Hagan. There it is.
Yeah. An article called Geoengineering Disinformation, 2 Opposing Testimonies and the Stakes for Humanity. And the most interesting part of this article is a long pilot testimony. Commercial airline pilot named Mark Hagan. He did 30 years of flying commercial airliners, and then, starting in 2005, he did 10 years of meticulous overhead observations. I really recommend people take a peek at that letter.
Our geoengineering.org, click the science button, it's at the top.
Yeah, it's the first one. Okay.
I am curious, is there any effort to sort of have congressional hearings or a state house investigation or anything like that going on?
I can answer that one. I know at least there's multiple states around the country where they're introducing legislation within the state legislatures to ban geoengineering. For example, New Hampshire introduced it last year.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. We talked maybe a little bit about it, but New Hampshire did, I believe. Tennessee.
Rhode Island was the very first state to introduce legislation, co-authored by Rosalind Peterson before she died, by the way. There's now 8 states that have introduced legislation.
And from what I understand is there's someone out there that if they get elected to office that they are going to potentially introduce this. I'm not going to name any names in Vermont, but somebody out there that I know who's fighting for this.
Going to do it here in Vermont?
Yeah, we should talk about it after, but I do know somebody who...
So I listen to those 3 states, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Tennessee. You've got blue Rhode Island, purple New Hampshire, red Tennessee. So this is not necessarily a red-blue thing?
Not at all.
That's encouraging from your point of view to get to know things.
Yeah, that's such a great perspective, Guy. Clean air and geoengineering free skies is an environmental issue that concerns not just all of us as humans, but all species on the planet, blue or red, or beyond.
Okay, so somebody says, I think we've probably really already addressed this. Maybe we should dive into it just a little bit more. is this for military application? I think we've already addressed this, but can we talk a little bit about the use of it, of the examples of the weather being used as a weapon?
Well, yes. I mean, we have addressed it. There are, and this book by James Fleming really gives you the full story on that question. At the end of it, you know the military is profoundly involved.
But what are they doing? Right, like right now in this decade, what's the military using this stuff for?
Well, that really requires another program, because they're not just doing, as Rosalie Bertell points out in this great book, there are two forms. There's chemical and there's wave. And we haven't discussed. Wave means energy. Electromagnetic.
Electromagnetic frequency.
Electromagnetic. So, Aurora, the
Aurora
harp
Borealis.
in
Sure.
Gacona is the most powerful heater. That means a beam into the ionosphere creates another beam down on Earth that disturbs the structure of the environment.
All right.
Sometimes in profound ways. So the idea that it may have the power to cause earthquakes, volcanic explosions. I'm going to take this moment to quote a Secretary of Defense, if I can find it.
And while you're looking, Ian, if I may,
Yeah.
the fun phrase I like to use is pump, jump, and dump. Let me explain. It's a three-phase process. We pump nanoparticulates into the atmosphere. We jump those nanoparticulate metals with electromagnetic energy. This is what the HARP complex, we jump them chemically speaking, right? I'm sorry, physics. We essentially
Electromagnetically.
use electromagnetic energy. We ionize the nanoparticulates, pump, jump, and then of course ultimately they dump, they fall to the earth, and we've talked about that.
Yeah.
Pump, jump, dump.
So in 1996, Secretary of Defense William Cohen projected U.S. military capabilities onto the nation's then putative but non-existent enemies. Remember, we're supposed to be enjoying the peace dividend. Okay? Were you around for that? No, you weren't. Yeah. All
Happy
right.
birthday, Paul.
All right, here's what he said, quote, "Others are engaging in an echo-type terrorism whereby they can alter the climate, set off earthquakes, volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves."
Wow.
Okay? It's real. And that's the reason why we have to intensify our efforts.
What
year was that?
1996, which is actually when most reports of persistent contrails. So you live near a major base.
Right.
You saw them. Okay, you can do that. The rest of us here lived in... I never saw these gosh darn things until this century. You know, for the prior 60 years, I never saw them. Yes, occasionally you could see one, of course,
Right.
and it was always a military
Right.
aircraft. When did they become routine? They became routine in 1996, 7, 8. And the person who covered that story was invited to do so by a then major environmental news service, ENE, I think it is. And this man, Will Thomas, was a pilot and an environmentalist who had been covering the Iraq War, the effects on the environment in Iraq. And the editor at Environmental News Services said, I got a guy who's complaining like hell about the spraying right out his remote rural home in northern Washington. Thomas undertook to cover the story, and it was he who really started the contemporary story of geoengineering.
Okay.
Covert geoengineering.
Yeah.
Anyone interested in the, by now, history should read his book, and start with an essay on our site, which discloses how it all happened, because he was brutally attacked.
Huh.
Ian's being very modest here, too. We have a science button at our geoengineeringage.org, which accesses our 50 peer-reviewed science papers or so. We also have an essays button that takes you to 2 environmental historical series, one on the emergence of geoengineering and the other almost finished on electromagnetic frequency technology and the history of that. And Ian Baldwin, sitting to my left, has written both of those, and they're important.
Okay. Good.
Okay, guys, moving on to the next question. Let's see if I can pull it up here. Okay. What does 5G and Starlink have to do with geoengineering? So, for anyone unfamiliar with Starlink, Starlink is Elon Musk's company / project to put satellites in the sky and into space ultimately, and provide internet service to rural areas, rural spaces, and really anywhere. I think this is one of the things they're trying to implement beyond just internet cables. What does that have to do with geoengineering, if anything? What do you guys think?
It's a hot topic in Vermont right now, rural connectivity, quote unquote. Yeah.
It's, I myself don't have much to say about it, although I am very disheartened by it, especially the attempt to get these transmitters into schools where they really this is a whole other, it is a form of geoengineering, but it is a whole other discussion. All I can say is the Vermonters for a Clean Environment are working on this project in the State House and the legislature. It is so powerful. No one is going to stop it, but at least we can hold the people responsible for unrolling it accountable. They have no business putting transmitters in schools. And that is your local school board issue. Any school board who permits that is reprehensible.
Or just vastly uninformed about the potential.
Or vastly uninformed, but they should be, because this is a technology that at the very least you want to do the protections you can.
Sure.
I would just add, when we think about satellites and 5G, 6G, remember that all living creatures, including humans, are beings of frequency. We communicate electromagnetically right down to every one of the trillions of cells that comprise our bodies. So when we introduce, as Ian just suggested, when we introduce powerful electromagnetic energies in the form of not just waves, but also pulsed waves, which 5G is, traveling in 4 millimeter waves in a pulsed fashion, that will disrupt the electromagnetic conversation being unfolding with all living and breathing beings of frequency. So we need to be mindful of that.
Satellites have been around since, as you know, the late 50s, 60s. I don't know what to make of Musk. And I mean, we're talking serious numbers here. Not 80 or 90, but thousands.
Yeah, and you can see them. I mean, I see them all the time.
Yeah.
And I'll just mention here, and this is listed at our geoengineeringage.org under our resources page. And Paul, I think you have the book here.
The Invisible Rainbow.
Well, that book certainly, Arthur Furstenberg's book, published by Chelsea Green.
Under an Ionized Sky.
The Invisible Rainbow, and Alana Freeland's second book in her trilogy, yes, called Under an Ionized Sky, where she looks at the creation of what she calls an electromagnetic space fence through the creation of these networked satellites. So I would say those two books, Invisible Rainbow, Under an Ionized Sky, are the two best books. They're both listed at our resources page.
Yeah.
Okay.
Those are good. That's good.
Yeah, Alana Freeland is potentially, at least in the geoengineering space, one of the most... Man, every time I read her book, one of her books I've read, Geoengineered Transhumanism, you have to go read it like 3 times because it's so thick. It makes you wonder how somebody could even write it. Like, how did she even...
We're going to get her on Creemee Cast.
Oh, we got to get her on Creemee Cast. Yeah, no, that's definitely going to happen sometime in the near future. However, we have a couple more questions. I think we've addressed this. Actually, quickly, Steve Diggs wrote in the chat, he writes, can you repeat the part about what school boards need to be aware of regarding monitoring? And I think you guys were talking about it.
Can I take this? Yeah, so recently in Vermont, and by recently I mean the past couple of months, there have been a number of conversations in a number of towns about a new book by a sociologist named Jonathan Haidt. The book is called The Anxious Generation. And Haidt's research looks at the impact of electromagnetically wired cell phones, mobile devices, bringing social media to the kids. Now, that might seem like a bit of a tangent, but it's not. Because when we're dealing with these powerful electromagnetic technologies, it's not just the physics and the chemistry of geoengineering or of electromagnetic energy. It's also the ways in which they impact our psyches, especially the kids who are still developing. So from a school board perspective, and I speak as a retired school board member of 16 years, former chair, I think it's really important that schools take seriously the idea of creating schools, families, communities where we draw much clearer lines around when and when not to use these devices and expose all of us to these not just electromagnetic energy technologies, these surveillance devices, but also the stories, the TikToks, the Instas, the Snapchats contained within.
Absolutely. That's a very important point,
Rob. The Anxious Generation, Jonathan Haidt.
Definitely. Okay, another question. We, like I said, we might have already addressed this a little bit, but I think we should touch on it again. What does HAARP have to do with the heating the atmosphere, and how many HAARPs are deployed around the world now? So Steve Diggs says thank you.
You're welcome, Steve. Great question. Thank you.
But the HAARP question, what does this have to do with heating the atmosphere, and how many HAARPs, if you will, are around the world? Ian?
It's heating the ionosphere, which is part of the atmosphere. It's that part that is like a blanket and crosses boundaries. It is not actually, to my knowledge, heating the atmosphere. These huge fields of antennae are beam weaponry. So they go up, and I don't know the technicalities of it. They go up and they heat a portion of the ionosphere that then rebounds another spot on Earth. There are a number of them. There are uncountable because they put them onto seagoing vessels. No one knows where they are. But we have maybe 4 that I'm aware of. Europe has maybe 2 or 3. China and Russia have them.
God only knows how many they have.
They don't have as many as the West does.
Okay.
The West is the leader. But they have them. I think the Russians in particular have a long history of playing around with them. Again, in our work, posted under science at our geoengineeringage.org, in our work, we don't really focus on them. Alana Freeland, who you'll get on, that would be a great question to ask her, and I'm sure she can explain it much better than I did.
Okay. Well, we definitely are going to have to make that happen sometime in the near future.
It will
Do you
happen.
have something to add to that?
Next rads, those giant golf ball shaped domes are another form of EMF technology, and there are dozens and dozens of those springing up.
It's widespread, like mushrooms.
Yeah, across the North American
After
continent.
rain.
And just a budget thing, so for fiscal year 2025, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, popularly known as NOAA, has requested a budget of close to $7 billion, with a B, $7 billion for the express purpose of monitoring the weather and engaging in what's called weather experimentation, which is a polite way to refer to geoengineering, to weather modification, to climate modification. Yeah.
A year or two ago, right?
This is actually in next year's budget. Just this number just dropped today. Yeah, $7 billion just to study, quote unquote, and experiment with, quote unquote, the weather, and that's a visible line item in a federal budget.
So does that have a congressional subcommittee that has oversight over that?
It's connected to the Department of Commerce. NOAA is under the auspices of the federal government's Department of Commerce.
So I would find out if, for example, I don't know, Becca Ballant or someone is on that subcommittee that has oversight over that, and see if her staff would be willing to look that up for us.
I love that idea.
Is she on that committee?
I don't know. But what I would do is find out who's on that committee, get in contact with their chief of staff or their staff, and say, look, could someone look into this for me? What exactly are they talking about here?
Love that idea.
I do too. Maybe I'll do it, guy.
Yes.
There we go. I guess I have an assignment.
Happy birthday, Paul. Happy birthday, Paul.
Okay. Are ships on the ocean dispersing chemical particulates for geoengineering? What companies are involved?
Yes. And there's a list of those companies on a number of different websites you can access through our page. It's a long list. And I honestly
Do you have
can't
any
remember.
of them?
I can't remember off the top of my
mind?
head. No, do you, Ian?
Where on our website would they find that?
It'd be under the resources page. There's links out to other organizations that track that.
Okay. That's called cloud brightening. And
When they do it to the ocean?
yeah, when they throw it up and it reflects.
And by the way, we're going to drop this new NOAA $7 billion budget 6-pager onto our Substack page at Our Geoengineering Age in the next week or so. And in that document, I know this because I read it this morning, are listed a number of the players. So that's where I would go to begin that, to answer that question.
Good.
Okay.
Good.
This is another question. We said, let's see here. What states, I think we already did actually address this.
Yeah.
What states have taken steps to address this?
Yeah.
But just to reiterate, let's say quickly, I believe it's New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Kentucky, no, Tennessee, and that's it.
And 5 others.
And Pennsylvania. Here's another website, Zero, spelled out, zerogeoengineering.com, is the grassroots policy activist website that is tracking state by state. Zerogeoengineering.com, which states are rolling out legislation. Zerogeoengineering.com.
Okay, so I think in terms of questions that we have here on the article, and from what we've fielded from our viewers and what we've put out online, I think we've really addressed everything. Although, here's one comment. We have a comment written in from Brandon Zolino who says, what role, if any, might the power of organized, conscious intention and other spooky, quantumly entangled paraphysiological phenomena be used to counter the chemical, electromagnetic, geoengineering ops? That's a Rob question, I think.
That's
I don't know.
My dear friend and buddy BZ.
I know
question,
Brandon. I know Brandon. Yeah.
Well, it's a wonderful question, and the short answer is this. This information is overwhelming. Ian and I have been working with it for many, many years, and it can be a little bit daunting. And like the climate activists, who may have the best of intentions, but are spreading an apocalyptic message of fear, to answer Brendan's question, we must counter the fear with resilience, as Governor Scott suggested the other day. And not just geophysical resilience here in Vermont to make our rivers, our streams, our roads, our bridges, our highways more resilient, but to make ourselves, our bodies, our minds, our spirits, to make ourselves more resilient. And that, I think, is the most powerful way, Brandon, to counteract, as you suggest, these powerful electromagnetic and wave and chemical activities that confront us. Build resilience of mind and body and spirit.
Okay. So we're going to put this out there to anyone who is still viewing. Anybody that has any more questions, feel free to write in. I don't know if anyone in the room has any questions. Guy, I don't know if you have anything you want to add. No, nothing.
Did we want to talk about?
We want to end with the governor.
Yeah, that's where I was getting.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Paul, if you so set it up for us, Paul, because this is all you, and I'll play the part of the Governor Scott, only because I have his reply here.
Okay, I said, Governor.
When was this?
This was the day following the flood, so I believe
Actually,
July 11th.
I do have something to add here.
Sure.
Normally, I cover these press conferences, but the flood, and I was stuck at home putting out the paper. So I send the rookie reporter to the governor's press conference, and what question does he ask? He asks about geoengineering.
Hey, well, I also
this was last Friday.
I also asked about the storm, the treatment plants, the sewage treatment plants,
Yes,
and
I
asked a important question
So this
too.
was like
I don't mind that you did. I'm just.
No, I know.
Happy birthday, Paul. Right. So this was 5 days ago now?
Yeah, this was 5 days
In
ago,
Montpelier.
Yes. Yeah, no, actually, in technically Berlin at the state headquarters agency of transportation, which is the emergency response headquarters for the state.
Most importantly, it's on high ground.
Very high ground. Yeah.
Whereas they used to hold the press conferences in the pavilion building, which got totally flooded out. So they moved everything up to the highest, almost the highest ground in Washington County, at least in Berlin, to the Dill building at the airport.
Yeah, that place ain't getting flooded.
So you talk about adaptation to weather. That's a good example of it.
Yeah.
I think about that actually all the time.
Yeah.
You know, you got the hospital up there, you have the airport up there, you have Walmart up there, almost as if it's like some sort of like base or something. Anyway, I'm not going to...
Let's get back to the press conference.
Sorry. A question. Okay. I asked Governor Scott a question. I said, we've now had 3 floods in Vermont in a single year. A growing number of our readers and Vermonters are concerned about geoengineering, persistent weather, and climate modification appearing in the skies above Vermont. Do you have any comment on that?
Governor Scott replied, climate change is real, and we all need to come to grips with that, no matter your political persuasion, and deal with it. Sentence 2. Yes, hold that up. We need to build back stronger, safer, and smarter than we have before. From my standpoint, I think these events are caused by carbon emissions, and we need to prepare for what's going to continue over the next number of years, regardless of what our strategy is to counteract that. We need to increase the capacity to store the water during these intense storms. That was the governor's reply.
That was most of his reply. I will just add quickly, and I didn't include this on everywhere it's been published. There was a bit where he said the Army Corps of Engineers is coming. They're planning to do a study on Vermont's watershed basins to figure out why is it flooding so much here. So that was part of his reply, and he was saying something like, well, when the Army Corps of Engineers come in too, that'll be really helpful to know the answer to why this is happening. So that's his reply. That was the question.
Yeah, and if we just take, Guy, what's your reaction to the governor's remarks as someone who's been in the room here?
That he was agnostic on the question, did not deny it, but was agnostic on the question of geoengineering, but went back to one of his constant themes, which is no matter what's causing it, we need to adapt to it. That's here on the ground in Vermont. His 9 to 5 or 8 to midnight job is helping Vermont adapt to all of this. And I do think it's interesting the Army Corps is coming in because the waters, especially we're talking the Connecticut River, New Hampshire, basically that is almost a federal problem. And I'll be very interested to find out how they answer the question to dredge or not to dredge, which I know is not what we're talking about here. But I got a lot of people saying, if we were just dredging, this would be going away. And other people say, no, it would just make it worse. So
dredging what?
Dredging the rivers and getting rid of all the debris and the clutter and the things that back up the waters and flood things out.
Yeah, there's been a clarion call on social media in Vermont from working Vermonters to get those excavators back in the rivers.
Rather than the Army Corps of Engineers, I mentioned working for the Environmental Defense Fund and other organizations in the early 70s. Half the time the defendants that we sued was the Army Corps of Engineers. And I'm not saying they won't help and couldn't help. I'm just saying, if a problem requires 2 fingers in the dike, don't put your fist in. The people who could help us live in Holland, in the Netherlands. They are the second largest exporter of food in the world.
That's right.
After the United States. They are a tiny country. They have had to deal with water for hundreds of years, and they have licked the problem. We'll present a different one, but the thinking of the ordinary Dutch civil engineer, I'm sure would be very useful here.
Yes. Let's get some Dutch people over here.
They might,
some Dutch
Wim Hof, get him over here.
Get him over here.
Get Wim Hof over here.
More coal plunging. Just to wrap up here, the governor's first sentence, we of course at our geoengineering age would agree with. Climate change is real.
It is real.
The challenge, I think, for us is to acknowledge the deeper and more complex extent of climate change rather than blaming carbon or carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases caused by you and me breathing and existing. We must, the environmentalist community, I'm speaking to my brothers and sisters here, we must grapple with and come to grips with the full extent of almost a century of weather and climate modification as a cause, not the only cause, but as a cause of climate change.
And how about environmental degradation as a whole?
Yes, particulate pollution, whether it's pushed up into the air by car exhaust or deployed by planes dispersing nanoparticulates. Particulate pollution, I think, is the #1 killer worldwide. I think that's
UN statistics. It is
from
the
our
#1 killer.
Yeah, and that's just humans.
Humanity.
That's just humans. So particulate pollution is a huge global problem, not just for us Homo sapiens, but for all living and breathing creatures, trees, animals, birds, bats, as we've been talking about.
Rob, or any of you, are there any Vermont environmental organizations that are not financially co-opted to the solar carbon message?
Yes, Vermonters for a Clean Environment, led by Annette Smith, is definitely not co-opted.
Good. Well, there's a bridge to build with, I suppose, for you folks.
Yes, we work closely with Annette and her team. And then looking at the rest of the governor's statements, Paul and I spoke about this. We need to build back better.
He didn't say better, though, did he?
He didn't say better, but that is a talking point, as astute Vermonters will recognize. That is a talking point from the World Economic Forum, and that phrase, build back better, stronger, has come out of the mouths of countless elected political leaders around the world for the past 3 or 4 years in the wake of the COVID situation, not to go down there. But so that was an interesting choice of language. And then, of course, Governor Scott flags carbon emissions. We would respectfully urge the governor to dig a little deeper and answer or educate himself on the question of geoengineering specifically. I think we can all agree he doesn't really address that here. But I love the final part of his answer. I think we as Vermonters have an obligation to one another, to our families, to our communities, our towns, our state, our once and future republic, dare I say, to really build more resilience, and not just physically and infrastructurally, but as Brandon's question reminds us, I think, hearts, minds, spirits. Let's stop blaming one another.
Yes.
And let's, as we always do in times of crisis, let's work together, as we have been the past week. And again, shout out to all the Vermonters who are maybe listening or watching this and just getting it done, because that's what we do.
That's right. No, and to that point though about what Governor Scott did say in his answer, I mean, I think it was a fine answer politically. I understand where he's coming from, why he's saying what he's saying. I'm glad that he does point out that we do need some solution to the flooding, because we just can't take this anymore. You know, we addressed it at the beginning to start the show, and I think it's probably a good place to finish. We can't just keep letting this happen, not asking important questions, and not taking action to mitigate some of the effects of whatever is causing the flooding. We need to do something. So I don't know if you guys have anything else to say. I'm all set.
So next month, I'm on the Berlin Board of Abatement, which is where people with tax grievances come in. Last year, the people who owned the mobile homes right down there on Route 302, they're all totally destroyed. They came in one by one and said, please abate our taxes. We haven't lived there since 4 days into the fiscal year, like after July 4th or 5th, I think it was. So yes, we abated their taxes. And that's a bit of a hit on the town, but we did it because, and now the owner of the property is coming in and asking a similar question. And it's sort of a fair question because the only what he did use that for was to have mobile homes on it. It's really, with the flood, it's not really worth much else. So the reason I bring up the story is the impact on our state and the fiscal bottom line, the housing. Got to do something about this because this is really hurting us.
Absolutely. Rob, Ian?
I'm pretty much done.
Our geoengineering.org, free public resource. We've been at it for many years. We'll keep at it many more. And Paul, happy birthday. Thanks for having us, Guy.
Absolutely.
Paige, publisher of Vermont Daily Chronicle, thanks for giving us opportunities to talk about this.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone. This has been a Bean Studios production live from North